Okay, I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so glad the heat is working. Just a little bit about paper here. In the back on the table that we use outside of the bookstore, there are 2 stacks of paper, which are different than the stacks that are coming by, but the 2 stacks there are Sam Dolby's presentations from 2 weeks ago. Several of you had suggested you would like to see those presentations. You may remember the first was a brief whirlwind tour of the history of the Middle East in the 20th century, and the second was a brief whirlwind tour of the history of the State of Israel. Now, I'm absolutely delighted to have Jacob Bender back here again as he was last week. I know that many of you were here last week and were delighted by his time, but not only has he come back from the far-off land of Manhattan, he's also brought Katerina, his wife, and Dahlia in the absolute best yellow pants on a cold morning that there is, out of bed early to help us out here this morning. You may remember that last week Jacob spoke about his own personal journey in interfaith dialogue and how that came about. And then we were all delighted to see a film clip of his film out of Cordoba about Middle Eastern Spain and interfaith life back then. But today he is going to give us something of a conversation about the state of Israel and the issues around Israel and Palestine. And I can tell from looking just briefly at the handouts that this is going to be very interesting. You should all have 2 handouts. One is, maybe I should have Jacob tell you what the 2 handouts are, so you really want to know. Jacob, God bless you for coming back again. I'm going to give this all to you because you're much better than I am. Here you go. You want me to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Great, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. We drove up this time rather than taking the train, and got a little bit lost. It was hard to find Connecticut out of Manhattan. No. So, we never go south of 42nd Street, so, or north of 125. So, anyway, last week it was more of a presentation, and this week I really want to do a conversation. The first page that I passed out, of course, all of you know that there was a big election in Israel last week, and we're really going to be talking about that this morning and the implications for the future of Israel and Palestine in the Middle East and Middle East-U.S. relations. So there are a couple surprises in the election. One was the narrowing of the support for Prime Minister Netanyahu. In my humble opinion, proof of the divine presence among the Israeli electorate. Then there was, so if you follow along the page, it says Israeli political parties in the 19th Knesset. The Knesset is the Israeli parliament. This is a sort of visual chart that shows you the breakdown of the election of the political parties. And on the back is a description of each party. Now, the Israeli political system, of course, is not like the United States with 2 main parties. It's proportional representation, so you vote for a party, not for a candidate. And the party puts forth a list of 120 candidates, because that's how many people there are in the Knesset. And proportionally, how many seats you get is what percentage the party got among the whole pie. So for instance, Likud got 23% of the votes, or that breaks down into 31 seats. Everyone see that? That was a drop of 11. That was a big, big drop for Prime Minister, which was considered a rebuke of his leadership. But it's unclear, because we don't know actually the minds of all the voters, in the same way we don't know the minds of the voters here, what was the reason behind people on the right and religious parties abandoning Likud and joining the other parties or voting for the other parties. The biggest surprise was a center party called Yesh Atid. If you look down in the middle of the picture, it says center. Yesh Atid, it means there is a future. It was started by a TV personality who left the broadcast booth. And no one exactly knows how he will play out his great showing of getting 19 seats. He's already announced that he will enter into a coalition with Netanyahu, but under certain conditions, extracting promises for domestic promises. On foreign policy, he has played both ways, sometimes more right-wing, where he says this, I'm talking now about Yair Lapid, the head of this new party, where he has said he favors going back into negotiations with the Palestinians, but on the other hand, he won't split Jerusalem, and he's not in favor of stopping Jewish settlement growth, Israeli settlements in the West Bank. The religious parties more or less stayed the same. The left-wing parties gained a few seats. Labor Party, which was the party that ruled Israel for the many years that after 1948, also gained a few seats. So this is a basic breakdown. Now, the major question before let's open it up for a discussion is how does the election influence the great question before Israel, which is its relation with the people it shares the Holy Land with, which is the Palestinian Arabs. Many people in Israel and outside, friends of Israel, including many in the American Jewish community, have come over the last decades to the conclusion that Israel has to face a difficult choice. If it wishes to stay a predominantly Jewish state, it has to relinquish control over the Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, and in East Jerusalem. Otherwise, the Arabs will outnumber them in their own homeland. And so if that happens, if they continue to keep the territories which they captured in 1967, there's only two options available. Well, there's a third option, but we'll get to that. The first two are, one, Israel keeps the territories, but doesn't give democratic rights to the Arabs to vote. And so that leads it down the road to an apartheid situation like existed in South Africa of minority rule. If it doesn't wish to rule over millions of Arabs who don't wish to be controlled by an occupying power, then it has to relinquish those territories but keep a democratic society. The third choice, which is very difficult to contemplate, is that it can also expel the Palestinians. Now, there are one or two right-wing parties in the Israeli Knesset whose position is exactly that, which is what they refer to in Hebrew as transfer, the word transfer, which is a euphemism for the expulsion of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from the lands in which they have lived for generations upon generations. So let me begin with a question that actually somebody asked me last week at the end of my presentation, which was, we know now that current Prime Minister Morsi in Egypt had made in the last 2 years before he became head of the Egyptian government, before the Egyptian revolution throughout Mubarak, he had made, when he was member of the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood, exceedingly anti-Semitic speeches. And somebody asked me, what is my response to that? And of course, I was very much against it. Any sort of racist speech, but particularly one which is directed against a religious community of which I am a part. But the question becomes, okay, this is a speech which he made. He's apologized for it. Whether or not one accepts that apology as authentic, what are the choices that we are left with? What is the choices that Israel is left with? If Israel chooses not to speak to people who make derogatory remarks about their religion or about their nation, does that preclude speaking to any Arabs, any Palestinians in negotiation? Is there a choice but to speak to Egypt and to try to enter into some sort of understanding with Egypt, a nation which has, in fact, diplomatic relations with the State of Israel? Anyway, the election happened last Tuesday, and so here we are. It was good timing because I don't know if Reverend Walsh timed my talk to be as a follow-up to the Israeli elections, but here we are. So if you have any questions based on these charts or the recent news that you've been reading and I'm sure following, go right ahead.
Whenever I hear a discussion about this area, the question of internationalizing Jerusalem comes up.
Mm-hmm.
And every time I've heard that question asked, I hear different answers. What is your take on that?
Jacob, could you repeat the question?
Yes.
For all the questions so that everybody can hear.
Okay. The question is, what about the internationalization of Jerusalem? And of course, people have different opinions about that, as they do about every other aspect dealing with the Holy Land, including the weather. So in the UN vote in 1947, which split Palestine, British mandate Palestine. Remember, British controlled the Holy Land after World War I up until 1947 when they dumped the whole problem in the lap of the UN. And the partition plan, in fact, that was accepted by Israel and the rest of the United Nations, even though the Arabs at that point rejected it, called for the internationalization of Jerusalem. The Israelis accepted it, but as a result of the 47 to 49 war, the Israelis took over the western part of the city, and Jordan took over the eastern part of the city, and the state of Palestine, which was supposed to be midwifed into existence in 47, 48, 49, never came about because Jordan took over the West Bank. Now, my position is that it's a great idea on paper to have that special city with so much significance for Jews, Christians, and Muslims around the world, in fact, to be internationalized. However, apart from the religious question, Jerusalem is also the main city for two national entities, the Israeli state or the Israeli political entity and the Palestinian entity. The Palestinian entity only growing in fervor since 1967. And so the solution that I and many Israelis and many of my friends in the American Jewish community favor is a virtual, not actual, splitting of the city between a capital of Palestine in the eastern part of Jerusalem and the western part of Jerusalem being a capital of the State of Israel. De facto, the state of Jerusalem is already split between Jewish and Arab neighborhoods. And so since 67, in fact, you have two communities in Jerusalem, but the city is not in any way united. Very rarely do Israelis go into the eastern part of the city, except for the holy sites, the Western Wall, the Sacred Wall, according to Jewish religion, in the Old City. And very few Palestinians enter into in West Jerusalem. And so the international position, including the position of the United States, is that in a future peace settlement, Jerusalem will be split, not with a wall, but with a line on a map between a western and eastern section, both becoming the capitals of their respective states. Now, the Israelis, of course, are opposed to this, including the new party which gained so much support, Yesh Atid, There is a Future. And I would argue that there is no future without a splitting of Jerusalem. But many of the right-wing Orthodox settler movement within Israel is attempting to now move into East Jerusalem, Arab East Jerusalem, and take over house by house certain neighborhoods. And there have been demonstrations of Israeli peace activists and Arab peace activists in East Jerusalem trying to protect these homes from being expropriated for religious right-wing fundamentalist settlers. This gives some of an answer.
Well, it's not as simple as Minneapolis and St. Paul then.
Yes, we hope on the road to Damascus, clarity strikes many of the people there. Yes, go ahead, sir.
How can the Israelis just walk into East Jerusalem and start appropriating property?
The question is, how can the Israelis just march into East Jerusalem and start appropriating houses? It's because they're the they're the law in that part of the land. Until there's a settlement and East Jerusalem becomes part of an independent state, the Israelis, in their mind, can do what they want because they annexed the city after the '67 war. They annexed the eastern part of the city, which they conquered. And there are two parts of the east. There's the part inside the walled city, the old city, and then there's the part of East Jerusalem outside of the walled city, which was built in the late 19th and 20th centuries. And so those parts are under Israeli law. But there have been court cases also which Israeli peace activists have brought to the Supreme Court trying to stop the expropriation. And so there still is a legal avenue left sometimes to Palestinians and Israelis who oppose the action of those right-wing settlers who are trying to take over East Jerusalem to make it another Jewish neighborhood. Yes, sir. Okay, I can't.
Sorry, it's not only East Jerusalem, it's the whole West Bank where the Israelis are just taking over areas. I mean, what's the legal mechanism by which they do it? Does the government say, okay, this is yours, now kick off the
Okay.
compensation? How is it done?
Okay. The question is, what is the legal mechanism by which Israel takes over places in the West Bank? So this is a terribly complicated question because in Israel there are 3 or 4 law systems at work that overlap each other, sort of like parallel universes in string theory, interacting with each other, rolled up dimensions which you can't really see. So there's the old Turkish law from the Ottoman Empire, which dates to the 19th century. Then there's British mandate law on top of that. Then there's Israeli state law on top of that. And then there's halakha, Israeli religious law, piled on top of that. So all of these interact with each other. And so really to practice law, you need to know all these 4 legal systems. It's terribly complicated. But the simple answer is that after 1967, Israel became the occupying force in the West Bank. And so it was never formally annexed, but as an occupying force, they determined that they could do what they want, even though international law said that an occupying force is forbidden to move its civilians into the occupied territories which they control. So the opinion of the international community and of international law, almost across the board, including that of the United States, is that the settlement project, which has now placed close to 500,000 Israeli Jews in the West Bank is illegal according to international law because it's moving civilians into a land which should be kept as a bargaining point for negotiations. And so those far-sighted Israelis after 1967 said, we should keep the territories and say that if the Arabs wish to sign a peace treaty, we will give everything back immediately. But that didn't happen. Yes, go ahead, sir. Oh, excuse me, let me get a woman. Okay.
What are the legal or political or philosophical arguments against making Jerusalem an international city?
Thank you. What are the moral or philosophical, legal arguments against making Jerusalem an international city? And I think the ethical or political reasons is that both Israelis and Palestinians feel attached to parts of Jerusalem as their capital. And so it would be like asking what would be the arguments against making Washington, D.C. an international capital. So these are two countries that feel very attached to their city. Now, if those two countries in a future peace settlement, God willing, or inshallah, would agree once that they control both of the parts or the two parts of the city as a capital, that they would see ceding international control or ceding control to an international body and how that would work, I think everyone would be happy. But the legal arguments, or the more the political arguments, is that these two entities see Jerusalem as their capital. But clearly there has to be some special consideration given for the religious holy sites. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the two mosques on top of the Temple Mount. So, to go back to my previous example, Jerusalem, of course, is not like Washington, D.C., because it has such tremendous international importance for people all around the world. Close to probably 3 billion people, if you can add the total number of Christians and the total number of Muslims in the world, are attached to this city for historical, religious, philosophical reasons. And those of us who have spent any parts of their lives there and just walking in the old city understand why that is such a powerful draw to many people around the world. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Realistically, do you think any future Israeli government will be able to remove those settlements that are not just joining the Israeli border, but all over the West Bank? I have a feeling that no Israeli government will be able to do that.
The question is whether any Israeli government in the future would be able to move out the settlers from the West Bank to make it easier to have a contiguous Palestinian state based on a good geographical settlement. And you're asking me if I'm a pessimist or an optimist. And my favorite line about that, I have two favorite lines. One is a quotation from the Talmud, which says, God does not require us to complete the task, but we are not free from beginning it. That is our obligation. And so we are mandated by ethical and religious reasons to work towards that goal and to hope that the situation changes in the hearts and minds of the Israeli people, that they will see that the continuation of the settlement project and the continuation of an occupation of millions of people against their will is not in their own best interest, besides being a violation of their ethical responsibilities as Jews and as human beings. The other statement is a quote that Robert Kennedy gave on the night when he found out that Martin Luther King was killed. And he said, "Some people look at the world and say, why? Other people dream of the world yet to come and say, why not?" And so I would hope that there will come a time when Israelis, perhaps under international pressure, and I'm not opposed to that, will recognize the futility of their political occupation of the West Bank. We also know that many of the settlers, perhaps more than half, moved into the West Bank not for religious reasons, but moved into bedroom communities because the government bribed them with low-interest loans. And so bribing them again and offering a payout to move back into Israel proper is not out of the question. And that sort of exchange is things which have already been negotiated and talked about in Camp David, in Taba, in Maryland, when there have been the peace negotiations between Israelis and Palestinian negotiators since the beginning of the Oslo process in 1992. Yes, sir. And then you, sorry, keep overlooking.
A lot of our discussion so far has dealt with almost intellectual views or scholarly views of questions that are thorns. But what we're not addressing realistically is the emotion that Israel is facing in terms of its neighbors, let alone the fact that even though Netanyahu's position has been diminished, the reality is that the momentum, for lack of a better description, hasn't necessarily been blunted. It may have just been slowed. So my question to you is, realistically, has the election made really any change in knowing the big picture with what Israel is surrounded by and the recent nuclear threats, et cetera, from Iran? Is there really any change that you foresee in the future?
The question was, we've been talking on a sort of scholarly and intellectual level. What is the response of the Israeli people in the last, was there a distinctive change in the electorate in the last elections? And what are the emotions or feelings of the Israeli people, as you say, surrounded by potential real enemies, and also including the so-called Iran nuclear threat? Did I get it all? Okay. Katerina and I have a very good friend who's a doctor of psychology, and her field is trauma. And she's studied a lot, actually, about Israelis and how that feeling fits into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And of course, it's silly to talk about lines on a map without talking about the real experiences of the human beings involved. One of Israel's greatest novelists, Amos Oz, who's a member of the peace camp in Israel, has written that we can summarize the conflict, the emotional part of the conflict, by saying that Israelis, when they see Arabs wearing their keffiyeh, the headdress, in fact see under that keffiyeh an SS soldier. And that when Palestinians look at Israelis, soldiers, they see not the soldiers of a country that was established out of the fires of the Holocaust, but they see more British and European crusaders marching into the Middle East. And remember, right after 9/11, former President Bush used the word crusader to describe the war on terror and our marching into Afghanistan and then Iraq. A poor choice of words, I would argue. And so, of course, one needs to deal with the fear of the Israeli people. But one of my favorite philosophers is Martin Buber, who was one of the first Jews after 1947 and 48 and the creation of Israel to argue that the Palestinian refugees who either fled or were thrown out during the 1948 war needed to be given rights and allowed to come back. Otherwise, Israel could not be complete and would never be a peaceful settlement. And so Palestinians also face fears of continual settlement and continual colonization. And so part of the necessity in dealing with conflict resolution in the Middle East is to have both sides address the fears of the other. And this is where Buber comes into play because he understood that so well. The nature of dialogue and the dialogical philosophy which he described was putting ourselves in the other's footsteps and understanding the fear of the other. And so it's not only Israelis who fear, but the other side as well. And we could go through the numerous wars that have happened and pinpoint that some of those wars were started by the Arab states and some of those wars were started by Israel. And so both sides feel fear, and our role is how to help both of those sides overcome that trauma and deal with the real world, not with their psychological projection onto the other from their own past, which may or may not be accurate in its description of the present. Yes, sir. Sorry to overlook you.
When I traveled Israel some years ago, I was told again and again by citizens that the average citizen in Jerusalem, disagreed thoroughly with their government and wanted the city internationalized because they realized the importance of the tourist business to their economic benefit. It benefited economic. I wonder, I never read about that anymore as an influence, and I wonder what happened. And if I went on the streets of Jerusalem today and polled the average citizens, how would they feel?
Again, my feeling is that most Israelis are opposed to internationalization at this point. The tourist business, I mean, Jerusalem has never really been internationalized, but the tourist business only suffers because of the security situation. So the question is how to solve the security situation to increase tourism. So going back to your question also, my feeling from having lived there and visiting many times is that very few Jewish Israelis, and again we need to separate when we talk about Israelis, remember that 20 to 25% of the Israeli population is not Jewish. It's Christian and Muslim Palestinian, Christian and Muslim Arabs. That most of the Jewish population is opposed to internationalization as it is opposed to giving Palestinians control over the eastern part of the city. So this is not my opinion, but this is my reading of the Israeli public. Yes, sir.
On Friday, I was reading analysis of the election, and they attributed the rise of the Yeshatid
Yes.
to more a concern for economic internal issues, and that Lapid was almost sort of non-committal in terms of foreign affairs. Is that your read, and what does that indicate in terms of trying to resolve the problem, or are the Israeli citizens just getting tired of it?
Yeah, the article you read and your description of it is absolutely correct. Lapid's position on the Palestinian conflict is not great. He's for return to negotiations, which Prime Minister Netanyahu has been saying he's for a return, but puts up many conditions and keeps building settlements, and it's hard to enter into negotiation with someone who is continually grabbing up your land. So most of the election was argued on domestic issues. And Lapid gained a lot of ground by saying that the extreme Orthodox Jewish community, which gets a tremendous amount of subsidies from the government, and doesn't serve in the army, doesn't do national service, but still gets their schools and their synagogues and their neighborhoods subsidized by the government, that level of subsidy should be taken away. And there should now be an equal level of responsibility borne by the extreme Jewish Orthodox community and the Arab community as well. So that was his big issue, a sharing of the burden, as he called it. And that was his way of gaining seats. But beyond that, I think there's a feeling of exhaustion in the Israeli population. In their minds, they went out of Gaza, and Hamas started shooting missiles into the south of Israel. And so they're wary of doing the same thing with the West Bank, even though I think the situation is far more complicated. And even though the settlements were pulled out of Gaza, they continue to have a stranglehold on Gaza itself. And so the occupation was just transferred to another power authority in another way. But as an optimist and as a person trying to believe in hope and faith, I continue to believe that there is a possibility. But this should bring us to another piece of paper that I passed out, which is a statement of 15 or so Christian leaders from around the United States who sent letters to Congress, who sent one letter to Congress calling for a level of pressure from the American government to help Israel and Palestine reach a peace agreement. Now, many in the American Jewish community, unfortunately, saw this as a scandalous declaration and is a sort of waving a red flag and almost threatened to pull out at times out of Christian Jewish interfaith dialogue, which I found unfortunate. So let me say at first that I do not want to represent my viewpoint as representing the mainstream in the American Jewish community. On a good day, I represent my wife and my daughter on the Upper West Side, and that's on a good day. Yes. So if you just look at that statement, and you can take these homes. I find it a very compelling statement, and was really thankful that Christian leaders had the fortitude to try to defy, in a way, the stranglehold that the Israeli lobby has on politics in Washington, and to break that mold and to say, we as Christians, imbued with the spirit of peace from Jesus Christ, need to insert ourselves into this quandary and to call for American pressure to bring about a peace settlement for the good of the Israeli people, the good of the Palestinian Arab nation, and the good of Middle East-U.S. relations. And so I'm very thankful that this letter was sent, and I hope that it will in fact have some impact in the halls of Congress and among our esteemed representatives in the new Congress. Yes, you haven't said it.
In a situation like that, where you have one party which has great leverage and the other party has almost none, how is a settlement going to be achieved without it being opposed, or without the weak party getting leverage and international support in order, and in essence, force a settlement? Do you see anything like that happening?
Maybe that and that, maybe A and B. So there was a famous professor of philosophy named Professor Leibovich in Israel, who, even though he was an Orthodox Jew, was very much opposed to the meshing of synagogue and state in Israel. And he was on record as the first person after 1967 to call for a withdrawal from the occupied territories, because he said that keeping control over this millions of hostile population will be the death of Israeli democracy and the death of the moral standing of the Israeli people. And he said, I have no shame. If we can't do it, please, God, please, the United States, force us into a peace situation. Many times when I've faced Jewish audiences in synagogue, which I do on occasion, particularly when traveling around the country with my film, and people say, how can Israel make peace, et cetera, et cetera. My argument that if you see someone in your family hurting someone else, your obligation should not be laissez-faire, should not be to stand back, but to say that we have to insert ourselves because we are connected to that. And so my argument to American Jews is that the path that Israel is going down is both suicidal and oppressive to other human beings. And that if we care about that state, it's not to rally around the flag and say Israel right or wrong, but to insert ourselves into that quandary, into that quicksand, into that morally difficult situation, and to say that we have an obligation to try to address this situation. Whether we see again the end result or not, we cannot say, but our obligation is not to stand back, but to insert ourselves. And that would mean United States pressure on Israel to say, unless the settlement enterprise stops, unless you stop building settlements, we will cut back on military and economic aid to Israel as a way of spurring the peace process and entering. This is what it means, blessed are the peacemakers. That's not an easy job, and I think Jesus knew that.
Last question.
Okay. Yes, you have an answer. Sorry.
Follow-up question. When President Obama came out very strongly against additional settlements, was there a stick that he waved? Did he threaten to cut back aid, or did he just say, please don't do that?
The question is with that. President Obama, a couple years ago, after he came into office, made a very forceful speech against settlements. What happened to that? Did he wave the carrot and the stick? Was there a stick? Was it? It was, in his great oratorical fashion, a wonderfully moral statement without much follow-through. In the same way that his first day in office, he said, as a moral country, we need to close down Guantanamo. Guantanamo is still open. So I wish that he would have said, you need to stop the settlements, and if not, there will be consequences. But perhaps now, freed from the burden of being elected for a third time, he will have more leeway in many, many areas. Gun control, the economy, the environment, and Israel and Palestine. We hope and we pray and we wish him well. So again, also Katrina, as I mentioned last week, is part of an amazing organization called September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. Please talk to her about that. They are really heroes on the face of the planet. Again, it's a great pleasure to be here with you, and I hope to come back someday and show my movie. So thank you, and God bless.
Wonderful.